May 1945. Europe froze in anticipation of the final victory over Nazism. Berlin has fallen. Hitler is dead. But the war is not yet over. In the very heart of Europe, the Czech capital, Prague, continues to remain under the rule of the occupiers. In a city that for centuries was a pearl of European architecture, an uprising is brewing. Barricades appear on the streets, and Soviet reconnaissance aircraft in the sky. The Red Army is already close, but for some reason it is slow to launch a decisive assault. Unlike Berlin, which was turned into ruins by massive bombings and artillery fire, Prague was supposed to meet its liberators differently. Why did Stalin, ruthless to the enemy throughout the war, suddenly show unusual restraint? What was behind this decision? Military necessity, concern for the preservation of historical heritage, or cold political calculation? The answer lies in the complex intertwining of military strategy, diplomacy, and post-war ambitions, where every step was part of a large geopolitical game. On May 2, 1945, Berlin fell. The red banner waved over the Reichstag, but the war continued. While millions celebrated victory, in Central Europe there remained the last major pocket of resistance, Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, one of Hitler's most fanatical followers. Nearly 1 million Wehrmacht and SS soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces were concentrated in Czechoslovakia, turning that country into the Third Reich's last bastion. Schörner, known for his cruelty even among German officers, ordered the execution of anyone who attempted to surrender or desert. His troops prepared for desperate resistance. From the east, 4 Soviet fronts rapidly approached Czechoslovakia, the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Ukrainian, and the 1st Belarusian. From the west, General George Patton's 3rd American Army advanced, having already occupied a significant part of western Bohemia and stopping a few tens of kilometers from Prague. The situation became critical for the German command. The encirclement ring inexorably tightened. However, neither Soviet nor American troops rushed to deliver a decisive blow to Prague. The reasons for this pause lay not only in the military, but also in the political sphere. After Germany's surrender in Berlin, signed on May 8th, Army Group Center found itself in a strange position. Formally, the war had ended, but they continued to fight. Schörner, upon receiving news of the surrender, secretly fled to Austria, abandoning his soldiers. Meanwhile, an uprising broke out in Prague itself on May 5th. The Czechs, learning of the fall of Berlin and Hitler's suicide, rose up against the occupiers. Barricades appeared in the streets, and street fighting began. The German garrison under the command of General Rudolf Toussaint brutally suppressed the resistance, using tanks and aircraft against the civilian population. The insurgents desperately cried for help, transmitting messages by radio in Czech, Russian, and English. Both Soviet and American commands received these signals, but the reaction was mixed. General Eisenhower, commander-in-chief of Allied forces in Europe, decided not to advance further east, despite Patton's persistent requests. The reason lay in the Yalta agreements, according to which Czechoslovakia was in the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin, for his part, ordered the start of the Prague offensive operation, but with significant restrictions. Soviet troops were instructed to minimize the use of heavy artillery and bomber aircraft when approaching Prague. This directive starkly differed from the tactics used during the storming of Berlin, where the German capital was subjected to massive air and ground attacks. On May 5, 1945, when the whole world was already celebrating the fall of Berlin, an uprising broke out in Prague. It began with a spontaneous protest against attempts by German authorities to remove Czechoslovak flags from public buildings. By noon, barricades were already being built in the streets, and calls for a general uprising were broadcast on the radio. Czech radio became the epicenter of resistance, transmitting messages in several languages. "Prague is bleeding! We ask for urgent help!" The Czech National Council, formed by underground fighters back in February, assumed the role of a provisional government. It was headed by Professor Albert Pražák, and military command was exercised by General Karel Kutlevacher. In the very first hours of the uprising, the rebels seized the post office, telegraph, and most strategic facilities in the city center. The German garrison, commanded by General Rudolf Toussaint, numbered about 30,000 soldiers, had tanks, artillery, and air support. They were opposed by poorly armed citizens, police who had switched to the side of the rebels, and a small number of partisans. More than 1,600 barricades grew in the streets, built from everything that came to hand, from tramcars to furniture from nearby houses. The Germans responded with characteristic brutality. SS men used Czech women and children as human shields, advancing towards the barricades. The Luftwaffe bombed residential areas. On May 6th, the situation became critical. The rebels were running out of ammunition, food, and medicine. At this moment, something incredible happened. Former enemies came to the aid of the people of Prague. Units of the Russian Liberation Army under the command of General Vlasov, who had previously fought on the side of Germany, turned their weapons against the Germans. The 1st Division of the ROA, under the command of General Bunyachenko, numbering about 20,000 fighters with artillery and armored vehicles, dealt a serious blow to German positions. This strange combat brotherhood did not last long. Already on May 8th, the Vlasovites, realizing what awaited them if they were captured by Soviet troops, began to retreat westward towards the Americans. On May 7th and 8th, the fighting reached its highest intensity. The people of Prague fought for every street, for every house. The Germans, realizing the hopelessness of their situation after Germany's official surrender, sought to break through to the west to surrender to the Americans, not the Red Army. This turned the city into an arena of desperate battles. The Czech National Council negotiated with the German command, trying to achieve a ceasefire and free passage of German troops to the west in exchange for preserving the city. However, SS units refused to obey surrender orders and continued fighting. By the evening of May 8th, the situation of the rebels became catastrophic. Ammunition was running out, food was scarce, and the wounded could not be evacuated. The Germans were preparing a final decisive blow. Desperate calls for help were heard on Czech radio. "Where is the Red Army? Where are our allies? Prague is dying!" Radio signals were received by both Soviet and American commands. General Patton, who was only 80 kilometers from Prague, was eager to help the rebels, but received a categorical order from Eisenhower not to cross the demarcation line agreed with the Soviet command. The Prague uprising was the last major battle of World War II in Europe. It demonstrated the determination of the Czech people to take their fate into their own hands and accelerated the advance of Soviet troops to the city. It was these events that presented the Soviet command with a difficult choice: how to liberate the city without turning it into ruins and without allowing mass casualties among the civilian population. February of 1945. In the Crimean resort city of Yalta, in the majestic Livadia Palace, the fate of the post-war world was being decided. Three great powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, gathered to define the contours of the New World Order. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Three leaders whose decisions determined the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. The Yalta Conference became a pivotal moment in the formation of the post-war order, when the world had not yet been fully liberated from Nazism, but its defeat was no longer in doubt. One of the main issues discussed in Yalta was the demarcation of spheres of influence in Europe. Stalin, who proved himself a skillful diplomat, secured recognition of the USSR's special interests in Eastern and Central Europe. Czechoslovakia, like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, fell into the Soviet sphere of influence. This was enshrined not only in official documents, but also in tacit agreements between the leaders. Roosevelt, weakened by illness, less than 2 months remained until his death, was more inclined to compromise than Churchill. The British Prime Minister, foreseeing post-war confrontation with the USSR, tried to limit Soviet penetration into Europe, but was forced to concede to reality. The Red Army already controlled a significant part of Eastern Europe, and it was impossible to change this by military means. For Stalin, Czechoslovakia held special significance. This industrially developed country with a powerful military industry could become an important ally of the USSR. Moreover, the Czechoslovak government in exile, led by Edvard Benes, demonstrated pro-Soviet sentiments. Benes, unlike the Polish government in London, did not put forward territorial claims to the USSR and was ready for close cooperation. At the Yalta Conference, a demarcation line was agreed upon, defining the zones of responsibility of the Allies in liberated Europe. According to this agreement, American troops were not to advance east of the Pilsen-Karlovy Vary line, leaving Prague and most of Czechoslovakia under Soviet control. This line became the subject of sharp discussions in the last days of the war. General Patton, commanding the Third American Army, repeatedly requested permission from Eisenhower to advance further east and liberate Prague. However, Eisenhower, following the Yalta agreements and not wishing to provoke a conflict with the USSR, categorically forbade such an advance. It was critically important for Stalin that it was the Red Army, and not the Western Allies, that liberated Prague. This was to consolidate Soviet influence in post-war Czechoslovakia. But at the same time, the Soviet leader understood that overly harsh actions, massive bombings and artillery shelling could provoke a negative reaction from the Czech population. Unlike Germany, the Czechs traditionally had sympathy for Russia, united by common Slavic roots and historical experience of resisting German expansion. Stalin sought to preserve and strengthen these pro-Soviet sentiments, which required a more delicate approach to the liberation of Prague than to the storming of Berlin. Joseph Stalin, a man whose name, even during his lifetime, became a symbol of an era. By May 1945, he had reached the zenith of his power. The Red Army occupied half of Europe, and the USSR's influence stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Now that military victory was evident, diplomacy came to the forefront, an art that the Soviet leader mastered perfectly. Regarding Czechoslovakia, Stalin pursued a special policy. Unlike Poland or Romania, where the establishment of Soviet influence was accompanied by harsh measures, the Czechoslovak direction required a delicate approach. President Edvard Benes, who returned from exile in London, was set on cooperation with the USSR. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia enjoyed significant popular support. Under these circumstances, crude military pressure could only do harm. When reports of the Prague uprising reached Moscow, Stalin personally intervened in the operations planning. At a meeting of the Stavka of the Supreme High Command on May 6th, he gave clear instructions to Marshals Konev and Malinovsky. Prague must be liberated but not destroyed. This fundamentally differed from the directives for Berlin, where the main task was to crush the enemy at any cost. The Soviet leader understood the symbolic significance of Prague. The Golden City on the Vltava, which preserved its medieval architecture, was not just a capital, it was a pearl of Slavic culture. The destruction of Prague by massive bombings and artillery shelling could cause alienation between the Czech people and their liberators. No less important was the international aspect. In telephone conversations with General Eisenhower, Stalin insisted on adhering to the previously agreed demarcation line, emphasizing that the liberation of Prague was the task of the Red Army. At the same time, he assured the American commander that Soviet troops would do everything possible to save the city from destruction. This was a classic Stalinist strategy: toughness in achieving strategic goals with flexibility in tactical matters. The Soviet leader was ready to sacrifice the speed of the offensive and even allow a temporary increase in the suffering of the Prague inhabitants just to prevent the Americans from entering the city and at the same time preserve its architectural appearance. Stalin's attitude towards the Vlasovites episode is indicative. When he was informed that parts of the ROA were fighting against the Germans on the side of the insurgents, he reacted pragmatically. For him, the main thing was not the punishment of traitors, but the political result, the establishment of Soviet influence in post-war Czechoslovakia. In his directives to the front commanders, Stalin particularly emphasized the need. Red Army soldiers were ordered to behave as liberators, not conquerors. Any excesses were to be suppressed immediately and harshly. This sharply contrasted with the behavior of Soviet troops in East Prussia or Silesia, where vengeance against the civilian population was tacitly permitted. This approach bore fruit. On May 9, 1945, when Marshal Konev's tanks entered Prague, they were met with flowers and ovations. The city, with the exception of certain areas affected during the uprising, retained its historical appearance. The political goal was achieved without excessive casualties and destruction, a rare case when military necessity yielded to far-sighted calculation. On May 6, 1945, an unusual tension reigned at the headquarters of the Supreme High Command. Marshals Konev and Malinovsky bent over maps on which the positions of Soviet troops and the German grouping in Czechoslovakia were marked. Stalin, pacing the office with his ever-present pipe, gave orders that differed strikingly from those heard before the assault on Berlin. The Prague operation must be carried out with minimal destruction to the city, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief emphasized. Limit the use of heavy artillery. Aviation should strike only at enemy concentrations outside the city limits. Directive of the Stavka, number 11,634, signed that day, ordered the troops of the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Ukrainian fronts to begin an offensive on Prague. But the nature of this offensive was special. Unlike the Berlin operation, where Soviet artillery fired hundreds of thousands of shells at the city and aviation dropped thousands of tons of bombs, Prague was to be taken differently. Marshal Konev, hero of the Berlin operation, received clear instructions. Minimize casualties among the civilian population, preserve the historical buildings and cultural values of the Czech capital. His troops were to cover over 100 kilometers in 2 to 3 days, a pace unprecedented even by the standards of the swift operations of 45. Particular attention in planning was paid to interaction with Czech rebels. Intelligence reported on the critical situation of the insurgents, but Stalin categorically forbade bombing the city, even at the request of the Prague residents themselves. It is better to lose a day or two, but save the city. Such was his position. At the meeting, the question of the demarcation line with the Americans arose. General Antonov reported on negotiations with Eisenhower, who confirmed that American troops would not advance east of Pilsen. Stalin nodded in satisfaction, but ordered to accelerate the advance. The Americans may change their mind if we delay. An important element of planning was the organization of tank wedges. Konev allocated the 4th and 3rd Guards tank armies for the swift thrust to Prague. Their task was not so much to destroy the enemy as to advance quickly to the city, to prevent its destruction by the retreating Germans. The directive specifically stipulated the need to preserve the bridges across the Vltava. Intelligence reported that the Germans had mined all bridges, preparing to blow them up during their retreat. To prevent this, special assault groups were created, which were to capture the bridges intact. The psychological factor was also taken into account when planning the operation. Experienced political workers were sent to the troops, who were to explain to the soldiers the special nature of the upcoming battles. The Red Army's soldiers were explained that the Czechs are a fraternal Slavic people, and Prague is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, which must be preserved for future generations. In early May 1945, as the Red Army prepared for the decisive thrust on Prague, the Third American Army, under the command of the legendary General George Patton, already stood on Czechoslovakia's western borders. The Americans, having liberated Pilsen on May 7th, stopped just 80 kilometers from the Czech capital. Patton's tank divisions could reach Prague in a matter of hours. Their equipment was fueled, soldiers ready for the march, and the general himself was literally itching for a fight. Patton, known for his decisiveness and aggressive style of warfare, repeatedly appealed to the Allied Supreme Commander in Europe, General Dwight Eisenhower, requesting permission to advance eastward. "My boys can be in Prague by tomorrow morning," he insisted in a telephone conversation on May 8th. However, Eisenhower was adamant. "Stay put, not a step further than the demarcation line." This decision was not an improvisation. As early as March 1945, negotiations between Soviet and American commands had taken place to delineate zones of responsibility. According to the agreements reached, American forces were not to advance east of the Pilsen-Karlovy Vary line. Prague and most of Czechoslovakia remained within the Soviet zone of responsibility. Eisenhower, unlike the impulsive Patton, thought strategically. He understood that violating agreements with the Soviet Union could have far-reaching political consequences. Furthermore, intelligence reported significant forces of Army Group Center still remaining in Czechoslovakia. The American Supreme Commander did not want to risk the lives of his soldiers in the final days of the war, especially in an operation that had more political than military significance. When reports of the Prague uprising and the rebels' desperate pleas for help reached Patton's headquarters, the general was furious. "We are abandoning people who are fighting against the Nazis. It's a disgrace," he declared to his officers. Despite this, the order remained in effect. American patrols that had advanced towards Prague were immediately called back. The Soviet command closely monitored American actions. Special liaison officers at Eisenhower's headquarters regularly reported to Moscow on the sentiments of the American General Staff. Stalin, receiving these reports, was satisfied with the adherence to agreements, but feared a possible change in the American position under the influence of the dramatic events in Prague. It was for this reason that on May 7th, when news broke of the start of negotiations between Czech rebels and the German command, Stalin personally called Konev and ordered him to accelerate the advance to Prague. "The Americans might change their minds. We cannot allow them to enter the city first," was his directive. The question of who would liberate Prague held immense symbolic and political significance. For Stalin, it was critically important that the Red Army be the first to enter the city, thereby consolidating Soviet influence in post-war Czechoslovakia. This consideration outweighed even military expediency, which dictated a more methodical advance with a thorough clearing of the rear areas from remnants of German troops. May 8, 1945, became the day when the history of World War II took one of its most unexpected turns. While Prague was bleeding in an unequal struggle against the Nazis, help came to the rebels from those from whom no one expected it: soldiers of General Andrei Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army. These people, considered traitors to the motherland in the last days of the war, turned their weapons against their former German masters. The 1st Division of the ROA, under the command of General Sergei Bunyachenko, numbering about 20,000 fighters with artillery and armored vehicles, entered the battles on the side of the Prague insurgents. The Vlasovites, understanding the hopelessness of their situation, decided on this step in an attempt to atone for their guilt before their compatriots and, possibly, to earn forgiveness. For the Soviet command, the news of the ROA's participation in the liberation of Prague was a real shock. When Stalin was informed about the actions of the Vlasovites, he reacted with characteristic pragmatism. Let them fight the Germans. This will not change their fate, but it can save the lives of our soldiers. The Supreme Commander understood that every German destroyed by the Vlasovites would not shoot at Red Army soldiers. For 2 days, May 6th and 7th, ROA units inflicted significant damage on the German garrison of Prague. They defeated SS units in the Zbraslav and Radotin areas, liberated several Prague districts, and captured the Ruzyně airfield. The Vlasovites acted decisively and effectively, understanding that this was their last battle. However, cooperation between the ROA and the Czech rebels was short-lived and contradictory. The Czech National Council, although it accepted the help of the Vlasovites, refused to conclude an official agreement with them, fearing the reaction of the Soviet command. For the Czechs, the Vlasovites remained Hitler's allies, despite their final turn. On May 8th, when the approach of Red Army units became known, Bunyachenko ordered his troops to leave Prague and move west, towards the Americans. The Vlasovites understood that in the event of capture by Soviet troops, they would face inevitable execution for treason against the motherland. Their withdrawal complicated the position of the Prague insurgents, but by this time, the advanced units of the Red Army were already approaching the city. Paradoxically, the actions of the ROA accelerated the advance of Soviet troops towards Prague. Receiving information that the Vlasovites were fighting on the side of the rebels, Stalin ordered Konev and Malinovsky to force the offensive. The Soviet leader feared that the participation of the Vlasovites in the liberation of the Czech capital could be used for propaganda purposes and undermine the prestige of the Red Army as the sole true liberator of Europe from fascism. On May 9th, Soviet tanks entered Prague, met by jubilant crowds. By this time, most of the Vlasovites had already left the city, but some remained and were captured. Their fate was sealed: a tribunal and execution for treason against the motherland. General Vlasov himself was captured by Soviet troops on May 12th and later executed along with other ROA leaders. The episode of the Vlasovites' participation in the liberation of Prague was suppressed for many years in Soviet historiography. It did not fit into the official version that only the Red Army brought freedom to the peoples of Europe. Only in recent decades have historians been able to objectively assess this controversial page of the war, recognizing the contribution of ROA soldiers to saving Prague from destruction. On May 9, 1945, the residents of Prague greeted Soviet tanks with flowers. The city, having endured several days of bloody battles, finally found freedom. But what struck many observers was that the historic Czech capital, unlike Berlin, Budapest, or Warsaw, retained its architectural appearance. Gothic spires, Baroque palaces, medieval squares, all of it survived the fires of war. How did this come to be? To understand the uniqueness of the Prague operation, it is enough to compare it with the storming of Berlin, which concluded just a week earlier. The German capital was turned into ruins by massive bombardments and artillery shelling. Soviet aviation carried out thousands of sorties, dropping tons of bombs on the city. Artillery fired hundreds of thousands of shells. As a result, the historic center of Berlin was practically wiped off the face of the earth. In Prague, however, the Soviet command chose a fundamentally different tactic. Marshal Konev, who received Stalin's order to preserve the city, forbade the use of heavy artillery within the city limits. Aviation struck only at retreating German columns outside the city. The main emphasis was placed on the rapid advance of tank wedges, which were to break into the city and prevent the destruction of historical sites. This tactic required significantly greater casualties among the attackers. Tanks, deprived of artillery support, became vulnerable to enemy anti-tank weapons. Infantry, forced to storm fortified positions without prior artillery preparation, suffered heavy losses. But the price was consciously paid for the sake of preserving the architectural heritage of the Czech capital. Why did Stalin, who spared neither his own nor foreign cities throughout the war, suddenly show such concern for the preservation of Prague? The answer lies in the complex intertwining of military, political, and cultural factors. First of all, by May 1945, military necessity no longer required total destruction. Germany had capitulated, and the resistance of Army Group Center was sporadic. Many German units were not so much fighting as trying to break through to the west to surrender to the Americans, rather than to the Red Army. No less important was the political calculation. Stalin perfectly understood that the attitude of the Czechs towards their Soviet liberators would largely depend on the price at which freedom was achieved. The destruction of historical monuments, the death of civilians under bombs and shells, could cause alienation and undermine the foundations of future Soviet influence in the country. Czechoslovakia, unlike Germany, was not considered an enemy state. On the contrary, it was to become a reliable ally of the USSR in post-war Europe. Edvard Benes, the president who returned from exile, demonstrated pro-Soviet sentiments. The Communist Party enjoyed significant popular support. In these conditions, the preservation of Prague's historical and cultural heritage worked to strengthen Soviet positions in the region. The cultural and historical factor cannot be discounted either. Prague was perceived as one of the centers of Slavic culture, a fraternal Slavic city. The destruction of such a symbol of Slavic unity contradicted the ideological line of the Soviet leadership, which emphasized the special mission of the USSR as a protector of Slavic peoples. It is significant that the directives of the Soviet command specifically stipulated the need to preserve Charles Bridge, a unique monument of medieval architecture. Special sapper groups were sent to defuse explosives planted by the Germans on the bridges across the Vltava. When Soviet tanks entered Prague on May 9th, the city greeted them not as conquerors, but as true liberators. The Czechs enthusiastically welcomed the Red Army soldiers, giving them flowers and treating them to wine. These newsreel footage went around the world, creating an image of the Red Army as a liberating army, bringing to the peoples of Europe not only freedom, but also the preservation of their cultural heritage. The liberation of Prague became not only the final chord of the war in Europe, but also the first step towards the formation of a new geopolitical landscape. The relatively bloodless entry of Soviet troops into the Czech capital, which preserved its architectural appearance, had far-reaching consequences that determined the fate of Czechoslovakia for decades to come. First and foremost, the nature of Prague's liberation created a strong foundation for the establishment of a pro-Soviet regime. The gratitude of the Czechs to their liberators was sincere and profound. The Red Army was perceived not as an occupying force, but as a fraternal Slavic army that brought freedom from the Nazi yoke. These sentiments were skillfully exploited in subsequent years to strengthen Soviet influence. The elections in May 1946 brought the Communists 38% of the votes, more than any other party. Klement Gottwald, the leader of the Czechoslovak Communists, became Prime Minister of the coalition government. The events of February 1948, known as the, quote, led to the full establishment of the communist regime. At the same time, unlike other Eastern European countries, the transition to socialism in Czechoslovakia occurred without large-scale violence and civil war. The preservation of Prague as a cultural and architectural monument was of immense importance for the national self-awareness of the Czechs. The city, which survived the Nazi occupation without significant destruction, became a symbol of national resilience and the continuity of Czech statehood. This contributed to the nation's rallying around the idea of reviving an independent Czechoslovakia under the protection of the elder brother, the Soviet Union. The special nature of Prague's liberation also influenced relations between the USSR and the Western Allies. Stalin's restraint, his willingness to adhere to the Yalta agreements, and his respect for the demarcation line were positively received in Washington and London. This created the illusion of the possibility of constructive cooperation between the former Allies in the post-war world, an illusion that quickly dissipated with the onset of the Cold War. Economically, Czechoslovakia's relatively undamaged industry became an important resource for the restoration of the war-torn Soviet economy. The famous Czech Skoda factories, which produced weapons for the Wehrmacht during the war, quickly reoriented themselves to produce goods for the USSR. Czechoslovakia became an industrial jewel in the emerging socialist camp. However, the preservation of Prague's historical and cultural identity also had consequences unexpected by the Soviet leadership. A city with centuries-old traditions of free thought and democracy could not remain indefinitely within the rigid framework of a totalitarian system. Already in the 60s, Czechoslovakia became a center of liberal reforms within the socialist bloc. The Prague Spring of 1968, with its slogan of "Socialism with a Human Face," became a logical continuation of Czechoslovakia's special path in the socialist camp. And although this attempt at reform was suppressed by Warsaw Pact troops, the seeds of free thought sown in those years bore fruit 20 years later during the Velvet Revolution.